It was 8:03 on a Tuesday morning, and Cassidy Voss was running out of time. She stood at the elevator bank on the ground floor of Aldrin Capital Group's Dallas headquarters, her phone pressed tight in her palm, staring at a contact she had already called 3 times since 7:15. No answer. The translation firm's automated message came on again, calm, professional, indifferent, and she ended the call before it finished. Outside, the Texas sun was already hard and bright against the glass facade of the building, the kind of morning light that made everything look more defined than it felt from the inside. Sheikh Tariq Al-Farhan would walk through those front doors in less than 50 minutes. This was the second chance, the kind of second chance that doesn't come with a third, the kind you spend years telling yourself you'd handle better if you ever got it, and then find yourself holding with both hands not knowing what to do next. And she had no interpreter. She was still staring at the phone when something made her look up, not a sound. Exactly more a shift in the quality of the lobby air, the way a room changes when something unexpected is happening in a space designed for predictable routine. Rowan Steele was standing near the center of the lobby floor, his mop resting against the side of his cart, and he was talking. Not to a passing colleague, not into a phone tucked against his shoulder. He was talking to Sheikh Tariq Al-Farhan, who had arrived 20 minutes ahead of schedule, and he was doing it in Arabic, unhurried, fluid, the kind of Arabic that doesn't announce itself or reach for the right word, because the right word was already there. The sheikh was listening with the specific quality of attention he gave to things that genuinely interested him, which Cassidy had seen only once in the previous 8 hours, and briefly, and then the sheikh was laughing. A real laugh, the kind that comes from the chest, rather than the throat, the kind Cassidy had not once heard from the man during the entire meeting the day before. She had spent 22 hours trying to save a deal. The man mopping the lobby had done it in 4 minutes. The previous day had started with every reason to believe it would go well. The conference room on the 24th floor had been prepared since 7:30, water glasses filled, folders arranged, chairs positioned at precise angles that communicated both seriousness and welcome, the kind of preparation that says we value your time before a single word is spoken. Cassidy had reviewed the term sheet one final time at her desk at 9:45, and then walked to the conference room feeling, for the first time in weeks, something that resembled steadiness. The Al-Farhan partnership had been 18 months in development, $340 million in the first phase, with an expansion clause that could push the total value of the relationship well beyond that over the following 5 years. It was the largest single transaction in Aldrin's history, and it was the deal her father had been laying the groundwork for in the final 2 years before he died. Closing it meant something beyond the numbers, beyond the press release, beyond what it would mean for the company's balance sheet going into the following quarter. It was the thing she had inherited that she had not yet figured out how to make her own. Gerald Fitch arrived at 9:45. He was 52 years old, with 2 decades of professional interpretation experience and a client list that included 3 Fortune 500 companies and 1 domestic government agency. His Arabic credentials were impeccable, formal, modern standard, the language of legal documents and international summits, and carefully constructed diplomatic communiques. Cassidy had booked him through the firm Aldrin always used for language services, and she had not thought to ask which specific dialect or regional variant he specialized in, because she had not understood that the question mattered. That was the first mistake, and it was hers, not his. Sheikh Al-Farhan entered at 10 o'clock precisely, accompanied by 2 members of his team, a senior advisor and a legal representative, both men who had been in enough rooms like this one to move through them without effort. The sheikh greeted everyone with the measured courtesy that Cassidy had come to recognize as his default register. Warm in tone, correct in form, saying exactly what the moment required and nothing beyond it. Marcus Holt, Aldrin's coup, opened the session and did so with competence. The numbers were accurate. The structure was clear. The first 20 minutes of the meeting proceeded the way Cassidy had hoped they would, and she allowed herself the small private relief of thinking they were going to be all right. Then, at the 22-minute mark, Gerald made the error that changed everything. The sheikh had been speaking about the nature of the partnership his family's investment group sought to build, not a transactional arrangement, but the kind of sustained collaboration built across decades and carried, as he put it, from one generation to the next. He used a phrase particular to Gulf Arabic business culture, an idiomatic expression that carried a weight in its original context that was nearly impossible to replicate in formal translation. The phrase was closer in meaning to a declaration, something spoken from the chest, something that said, "I am committing my name to this," and in modern standard Arabic, it had no direct equivalent. Gerald translated it literally, and the result in English sounded like a condition, a hedge, the specific language of someone leaving themselves a door open rather than closing it behind them. Marcus heard it and reacted before Cassidy could intervene. He leaned forward, his tone polished and controlled but unmistakably defensive, and asked a clarifying question that reframed the Sheikh's statement as a reservation rather than a pledge. It was the question you ask when you believe the other side is protecting their exit, and it was precisely the wrong response to what had actually been said. The Sheikh's expression did not change. He was a man who had negotiated across cultures for 30 years, and he had the discipline of someone who understood that visible reactions were their own kind of statement. But he set his pen down on the table in front of him, and for the remaining hour and 11 minutes of the meeting, he did not pick it up again. The session ended at 12:47, 73 minutes ahead of schedule, and without the signatures anyone in that room had come to collect. Handshakes were exchanged, with the same careful courtesy that had opened the morning. The Sheikh departed with his team, and the room emptied behind them, and Cassidy stood at the window with the Dallas skyline beyond the glass and the unsigned term sheet still sitting at the head of the table. The email from the Sheikh's assistant arrived at 2:15. His Excellency would need additional time to review the timeline. It was a single sentence, politely constructed, and it carried the specific weight of an ending that hadn't been formally announced. Cassidy read it twice in the elevator, alone, on her way up. She stayed at her desk until 9 o'clock that evening, not because there was work that couldn't wait, there wasn't, not in any form that would change the situation, but because sitting at her desk in this building felt different from conceding the day, and she wasn't ready to concede it. She had the term sheet on one screen and the email on the other, and she worked backward through the afternoon, the way you work backward through a route after an accident, trying to locate the exact moment the trajectory changed. She found it at minute 22. She understood what had gone wrong, and she understood why. The harder question was whether it was something that could be addressed at all, and at what cost to try. At 9:45, she picked up her phone and called the Sheikh's assistant directly. She dialed the number herself, without involving her communications team, or asking Marcus to make the call on behalf of the company. She waited through 4 rings before someone answered. She did not open with an apology. She explained what she believed had happened, that a translation error had produced a misreading of the Sheikh's intent, and that her team had responded to the misreading rather than to what had actually been said. She said the responsibility for placing the wrong interpreter in that room was hers. She had not asked the right question when vetting the service, and that was not Gerald Fitch's failure to disclose, it was hers to determine. She asked for 45 minutes the following morning, not to renegotiate terms, not to revisit the structure of the deal, just to correct a single misunderstanding that she believed had altered the course of a meeting that had otherwise been conducted in good faith on both sides. There was a pause on the line. The assistant said he would pass the message to His Excellency. At 11:30, her phone lit up on the nightstand. The Sheikh would be available at 9 o'clock. 45 minutes, the assistant's voice gave her nothing to read, neither encouragement nor warning, just the information. Cassidy set the phone down and closed her eyes. She slept for 3 hours, which was more than she expected. By 6 in the morning, she was working through every professional interpretation service with Gulf Arabic specialization that operated in Dallas. The list was short. She reached voicemails, early morning staff who took messages with polite efficiency, and one coordinator who confirmed availability before discovering that their Gulf dialect specialist was already committed to a legal deposition on the other side of the city. By 7:30, she had exhausted every name she had. By 7:45, she was calling firms in Houston and asking whether anyone could reach Dallas by 9, and learning that they could not. At 7:58, she dialed the last number on her list, and it rang 4 times and rolled to voicemail, and she was standing at the elevator bank on the ground floor of her own building, with 50 minutes until the Sheikh's arrival, and nothing left to try. She was still looking at her phone when she looked up. Cassidy moved across the lobby without hurrying. She understood. even before she had fully decided what she was going to do, that the pace and manner of her approach would shape what she walked into, and she didn't want to change what was already happening. She went to the column nearest the front entrance and stopped there, where the angle gave her a clear view without announcing herself, and she watched. Rowan Steele was a man she had passed in this lobby hundreds of times. She knew his face the way you know the face of someone who occupies the reliable periphery of a space you move through with purpose registered, categorized, never quite focused on. He was 38, with the kind of physical stillness that read as composure rather than passivity, the kind that comes from having learned to be present in a room without needing to be noticed in it. She had been aware of him in any specific way only once 6 months earlier, when he had held the elevator door open for her without being asked. She had nodded at him. That was the full extent of what she knew about the man who had been cleaning the ground floor of her company every morning for 4 years. What she was watching now did not fit into any category she had. He was speaking Arabic with the ease of someone for whom the language was simply part of how the world worked, not constructed, not effortful, not the carefully managed fluency of a person translating in their head before speaking. He was in mid-conversation, already past the place where two people are negotiating the terms of how they're going to talk, already in the place where they simply are. The sheikh was responding with the same naturalness, his posture open, his hands moving slightly when he made a point, his attention fully given. They had started, as far as Cassidy could determine from the brief gestures toward the walls and the ceiling, with something about the building, and had moved from there into something she couldn't name but could feel the quality of from 20 feet away. She watched the sheikh's body. In the conference room the day before, he had held himself with the specific uprightness of a man in a formal situation who has decided to be patient present but held at a certain measured distance from the proceedings. What she was watching now was different in ways that were difficult to articulate but impossible to miss. His shoulders had dropped. His attention was complete in a different way, the way of someone who has encountered unexpectedly a person worth actually talking to, not just responding to. Rowan said something, a short observation, maybe a single sentence, delivered without any particular emphasis. The sheikh went still for a moment. Then he placed his right hand flat against his chest. Cassidy had read about this gesture in the briefing materials before the first meeting. In Gulf Arabic culture, it was one of the most genuine expressions of respect and sincerity available in an unscripted moment. Not a diplomatic tool, not a performance, not something you did because the situation called for it. It was simply honest. Then Rowan turned back to his cart and picked up the mop handle, and the morning continued around them the way it always did, because for him it had never stopped. The sheikh looked after him for a moment, then he looked across the lobby and found Cassidy standing at the column. They held each other's gaze for a beat, long enough for something to move between them that didn't require any words. Then Sheikh Al-Farhan glanced deliberately toward Rowan, a small, unhurried shift of attention, and looked back at her. The message was clear enough to need no translation. Cassidy crossed the lobby and stopped a few feet from Rowan's cart, and she waited for him to look up, because she had understood already, from watching 30 seconds of him in conversation, that this was not a man you interrupted. He looked up when he was ready, which was almost immediately. His eyes were calm and direct, the eyes of someone who had long since stopped needing to announce himself. She asked what they had talked about. He told her. The sheikh had wanted to know when the building was constructed. He had answered, and then the conversation had moved to the history of the neighborhood around it, and from there it had gone somewhere else. He reported this the way you report the contents of an uneventful morning accurately, without embellishment, with no apparent awareness of how unusual any of it was. She asked if he could be in the conference room on the 24th floor for 45 minutes. Something moved through his expression, not surprise, more a quiet internal adjustment, the recalibration of someone who has just been handed a piece of information that changes what the situation actually is. He told her he was in the middle of his shift. She told him she would arrange coverage. She started to mention additional pay, and he stopped her, not unkindly, but with a directness that said the conversation didn't need to go there. She had been interrupted in mid-sentence in this building perhaps twice in the last 2 years, and both times it had irritated her. This time it didn't. He looked at his watch and mentioned the 3:30 pickup. She told him the meeting would be finished well before 11. He considered this genuinely. the actual weighing of something against something else, and then he said he would do it. He turned and leaned the mop against the wall beside his cart, setting it with the care of someone who intends to come back for it and wants it to be exactly where they left it. Cassidy watched the gesture, and for a reason she couldn't have explained, it settled something in her. The 24th floor conference room looked the same as it had the morning before. Same water, same folders, same view of the Dallas skyline through the west-facing windows. What was different was the man standing at the far end of the table in a building services uniform, reading through the term sheet Cassidy had placed in front of him 10 minutes before the session was set to begin. Marcus Holt's reaction to seeing him was immediate. He began to say something. Cassidy looked at him across the table, and he stopped. She told the room that Rowan Steele would be providing interpretation support for the session. She said it once, clearly, in the tone she used for things she had already decided and did not intend to revisit. When the sheikh entered 2 minutes later, he saw Rowan before he saw anyone else. He paused in the doorway a single beat, a small adjustment, and then the expression on his face shifted into the smile Cassidy had watched happen in the lobby. Genuine, unguarded, uncurated. He said something in Arabic. Rowan answered. The two members of the sheikh's team exchanged a brief look, the kind that passes between people who have just recognized that the room they've walked into is not the one they expected. They sat down and the meeting began. What happened over the next hour and 44 minutes was not something Cassidy had seen in a negotiation room before, and she had spent 11 years in a great many of them. Interpretation, in her experience, was a kind of faithful relay. One party says something, the interpreter carries it across, the other side receives it. Useful, necessary, mechanical in the way that any act of precise transmission is mechanical. What Rowan did was not that. He moved between the parties the way someone moves between two places they both belong to, not as a carrier between foreign territories, but as someone who understood the terrain on both sides and knew where the ground was level and where it dropped. When the sheikh expressed the idea of long-term partnership using the Gulf idiomatic phrase that had caused the breakdown the previous day, Rowan translated it into English with the same weight and intention the phrase carried in Arabic. The Aldrin team heard commitment, because that was what was being offered, and they responded accordingly. When one of the sheikh's advisors raised a concern about implementation timeline using language that would have sounded blunt in direct translation, Rowan rendered it with enough cultural context that the room could hear the concern accurately rather than defensively, and respond to what was actually being asked. Once, about 40 minutes into the session, Marcus began to formulate a response that Cassidy recognized: the slight forward lean, the particular set of his jaw, the setup for the same defensive posture that had cost them the room the previous day. Rowan spoke before he got there. He offered a brief remark directed at the sheikh's team, framed as clarification of the preceding exchange, that redirected the floor entirely without drawing attention to what it had redirected. Marcus paused. He rerouted. The meeting continued without interruption. At 10:44, Sheikh Tariq Al-Farhan signed the letter of intent. $340 million. First phase. The pen moved across the document with the unhurried authority of a man who had made his decision some time before the moment of signing and was now simply completing the formality of it. When it was done, he looked up at Cassidy and told her, in English, that calling directly the night before had been the right thing to do, and that what she had done this morning had also been the right thing. He let his attention move toward Rowan for a moment, a deliberate, unhurried pause, and then he stood, and his team stood with him, and they moved toward the door. Marcus remained in his seat after the delegation had gone. He told Rowan that what he'd done was impressive. He said the word in the tone of someone who means something adjacent to it. He explained that the company operated within structured hiring frameworks, with established criteria and defined pathways, and that the circumstances of the morning, unusual as they were, didn't constitute a basis for anything ongoing. He said all of this with the smoothness of someone who had worked the sentences out in advance. Rowan looked at him for a moment without saying anything. Then he pushed his chair neatly back under the table and walked out of the room. Marcus found Priya Tanaka at 2:15 that afternoon. He told her he needed Rowan Steele's complete personnel record, not just his current employment file, but everything available from before his time at the company. He used the word thorough more than once. He said it was standard due diligence. His voice was level and his framing was careful. and every word he chose made his actual goal transparent to anyone who was paying attention. Priya said she would review the appropriate process. Within 10 minutes of Marcus leaving her office, she sent a text to Rowan Steele's personal number. 4 words. Marcus is asking questions. Eli's school released early on a Thursday because of a rescheduled parent-teacher event, and Rowan had less than 2 hours' notice. His usual arrangement for unexpected early pickups fell through a text message, an apology, a situation no one had planned for. He was still on site completing the second half of his shift. The only option was to bring Eli into the building. Dennis at the security desk, a man who had worked ground floor mornings at Aldrin for 11 years and knew Eli by name, told Rowan to leave him at the lobby bench, and he'd keep an eye on him. Eli was 7 years old and experienced at waiting. He found a spot on the upholstered bench near the large south-facing windows, took the book out of his backpack, and opened it to where he'd left off the night before. Cassidy came through the lobby at 3:30, returning from a meeting in the building next door. She had her phone in one hand and a clear destination in mind, which was her office on the 24th floor, where 3 things were waiting that all needed to happen before 5. She walked at the pace she always walked in this lobby, forward, purposeful, aware of the space without actually being present in it. She slowed down before she had decided to. The boy on the bench had a particular quality of stillness that was different from ordinary childhood waiting. Most children in an unfamiliar space carry a low-grade restlessness, even when they're sitting, a shifting of weight, a scanning of faces, a fidgeting with whatever's within reach. This one was reading, actually reading, with the focused, inward attention of someone for whom the book was currently more interesting than the room. She stopped. She asked him who he was waiting for. He looked up and assessed her in the careful, unhurried way of a child who has learned to take a moment before deciding how to respond to an adult he doesn't recognize. He told her his father's name and his father's position at the company, and then, in the same breath and with the same matter-of-fact tone, he mentioned that his dad had been in a meeting upstairs that morning. He said both of these facts as though they were of equal weight, because to him, they were a morning of meetings and a morning of cleaning, were both just things his father did, and neither of them was the interesting thing about his father. Cassidy sat down on the bench beside him. She asked what he was reading. He showed her. A world atlas, a proper one-detailed cartography, informational margins in small print, the kind designed for adult use rather than simplified for children. The open page was the Arabian Peninsula. He told her his father had been teaching him the countries in that part of the world. He said he knew 14 of them. Then, without being asked, he began pointing to them one at a time, placing his finger on each one carefully, and naming it with the pronunciation of a child who had been taught by someone who cared about getting the sounds right. Cassidy looked at the maps and listened. She did not think about the letter of intent on her desk, or the board meeting on Thursday, or the 3 things waiting in her office. She listened to a 7-year-old name countries on a page his father had taught him, and the afternoon light through the south windows was warm and steady, and for several minutes nothing else was required of her. Rowan came down at 4:15, 45 minutes later than he had planned. Marcus had intercepted him in the hallway outside the building services office and conducted what he described as a post-meeting administrative debrief, a methodical process of questions about documentation and internal reporting protocol that was slow in a deliberate way. Rowan had answered every question fully and accurately. He had understood the purpose of the conversation from the first question. He said nothing about that understanding. When he came through the elevator doors into the lobby, the first thing he saw was Eli and Cassidy on the bench together. He stopped a few steps back from where they would notice him and stayed still for a moment. His son was pointing at something in the atlas. The CEO of the company was leaning slightly forward to see where he was pointing. Eli spotted his father and crossed the lobby at a run, talking before he arrived something about Muscat, about how the woman on the bench knew it was the capital, about how he had tested her on 3 different countries, and she had gotten 2 of them right. Rowan looked past his son to Cassidy. She had stood up, and there was something in the way she was standing, a slight unsettling of her usual composure, the expression of someone caught in the middle of doing something outside their own plan that he hadn't seen on her before. He walked Eli out to the car and got him settled with the atlas open in his lap and the radio on low. Then he went back to the lobby entrance. Cassidy was still there. She said his name. He waited. She said thank you. She said it the way people say it when the word is carrying more than it was built for, when gratitude has to stand in for something more layered and more true. He told her it wasn't necessary. She told him it was, and her voice in that moment had a different quality than it did in the elevator that morning or in the conference room, less managed, closer to something real. Then she told him what she had been deciding whether to say since she'd sent the text to Priya. She told him Marcus was going to use process as a mechanism, that the conclusion would be decided in advance and the framework would be applied to reach it. She said this plainly, without softening it into speculation. Rowan said he knew. She asked if that worried him. He was quiet for a moment, not performing consideration, actually doing it, weighing something against something else. He told her he carried more worries than he could easily list, and that this particular one was not near the top. There was no performance in the way he said it, no resignation, no bitterness. It was the statement of a man who had organized his concerns in a specific order that had been arrived at through things harder than preference, and who had found, over time, that the order was usually right. He said goodnight and walked toward the parking structure entrance, and his steps were even and unhurried, and he didn't look back. Cassidy stood at the lobby entrance and watched him go, and the Dallas evening was warm, and the traffic moved beyond the glass in both directions, and she stood there for a while before she went back in. The next morning, Priya sat down in Cassidy's office and waited for the door to close. Cassidy told her she wasn't asking about academic credentials or prior professional titles or any of the things Marcus had been building his case around. She was asking one question: why was a man who had just navigated a $340 million negotiation in Gulf Arabic and done it better than anyone Aldrin had available spending his mornings mopping the ground floor? Priya had been waiting for this question for 4 years. She answered it. Rowan Steele had spent 12 years at the Office of the United States Trade Representative. He had worked directly on bilateral trade agreements in 9 countries, functioning in those rooms, not just as interpreter, but as active negotiating presence, the person who could hear what the other side was communicating beneath the formal surface of their stated positions and render it in real time in a way that actually moved things. He was fluent in 9 languages: English, Arabic, Mandarin, Spanish, French, Portuguese, German, Japanese, and Russian. In the final years of his time at the USTR, he had been considered for a senior posting in Geneva. He resigned in the spring of 2021. His wife had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in the winter of 2020. She died on a Thursday in March of the following year, 3 weeks before Eli's 4th birthday. Rowan submitted his resignation the following Monday. He needed work that paid every 2 weeks and left him free at 3:30 in the afternoon. The corporate sector required the graduate degree he hadn't completed. Freelance interpretation paid sporadically and required travel. The facilities director at Aldrin at the time, a man who had retired the previous year, had agreed, when Rowan applied 4 years ago, to structure his shift around the school calendar. The arrangement had continued after the director's retirement by institutional habit and nobody's particular attention. Cassidy held the summary Priya had printed and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Then, she asked whether the sheikh had known, whether something in those 6 minutes in the lobby had told Sheikh Al-Farhan who Rowan was and what he had done before he came to work here. Priya said she wasn't certain, but she thought it might not have been knowledge that the sheikh recognized. It might have been something harder to name: the dialect, the register, the specific way Rowan addressed him, not as a subject to be managed or a transaction to be completed, as a person worth actually talking to. The difference between those two things, she said, was not subtle to someone who had spent 3 decades in rooms where it mattered. Cassidy set the summary on her desk. She thought about the lobby that morning, the sheikh's hand against his chest, the gesture that didn't need any explanation. She thought about the conference room and the day before and the quality of the difference between them. She thought about a man who had negotiated trade agreements on behalf of the United States in 9 countries and had spent the last 4 years making sure the ground floor was clean before the building opened. She folded the summary. She knew what she was going to do. The board meeting was Thursday morning, and Cassidy walked in and placed a single sheet of paper in front of each person before she sat down. It documented 3 things: the outcome of the Al-Farhan session, including the signed letter of intent and its terms, the direct and specific role Rowan Steele had played in reaching that outcome, and her formal proposal for a position of Director of International Relations, with compensation that reflected what the work was actually worth, a schedule built around the constraints of a parent raising a child alone, and a reporting line directly to the CEO. The objections came in the order she had anticipated: process, prior credentials, precedent. She addressed each point without raising her voice, because she had prepared for every question and the answers were sufficient. Marcus waited until the procedural objections had run their course, and then raised what he called a question of institutional credibility. He used the word twice. Cassidy reached into her folder and placed a second document in front of each board member. It was a transcript of Marcus's conversation with Priya the previous afternoon, the full exchange, including his specific request for Rowan's pre-employment history, his framing of the request as due diligence, and Priya's account of what the conversation had actually been for. 3 pages. Enough copies for everyone present. The room was quiet for a long moment. Marcus looked at the pages in front of him. No one said anything. Cassidy continued. She found Rowan in the 3rd-floor supply room at the end of the afternoon, restocking his cart with the methodical care of someone who had done it 10,000 times and still brought full attention to each item. She set an envelope on the shelf beside him and told him it was a formal offer, and he should read it when he had time. He didn't reach for it immediately. He looked at it. Then he asked about the hours. She told him the schedule was flexible, and that the 3:30 pickup was his every single day, and that she meant this as a structural condition of the role, and not as a courtesy subject to revision when things got busy or a quarter got difficult. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he needed to talk to Eli. She looked at him. He was not using the phrase the way people usually used it, as a soft deflection, a way of buying time. He was going to go home and consult his 7-year-old son about whether this was the right thing, and he was going to take the answer seriously, and that was what he meant. She asked, because she found she genuinely wanted to know whether he made all major decisions this way. He said yes. Every one of them. She didn't have a response to that. She stood in the doorway of the supply room for a moment, and then she left. 3 days later, Eli was at the kitchen table, with a half-finished bowl of cereal and a piece of toast he was eating, in the distracted, intermittent way of a child whose attention is mostly somewhere else. His feet didn't quite reach the floor. The World Atlas was on the table beside his bowl, open to a page somewhere in East Asia. He looked up and asked his father whether he liked the new job. Rowan was at the kitchen counter, pouring his first cup of coffee. Through the window, the Dallas sky was still the deep blue of early morning, the particular shade that only holds for a few minutes before the sun gets fully underway and burns it to something lighter and less honest. It was the kind of blue that Rowan had always preferred to the brighter versions. It didn't ask anything of you. It was just what it was. He looked at it for a moment before he turned around. He told Eli to ask him again in a week. Eli asked why. Rowan set his coffee on the table and pulled out the chair across from his son and sat down. He looked at this child, careful, serious, patient in the way his mother had been patient, with a father's habit of taking in more than he showed, a boy who could name 14 countries on a map because they had sat at this same table together and gone through them one at a time, one evening at a time, across 3 years of evenings that Rowan had organized his entire life around being present for. He said that he wanted to be sure before he said something was good, that he thought it was better to wait until you were certain than to say something before you had earned the right to say it. That words meant more when they had been held for a while first. Eli thought about this with the gravity he brought to most things. He was not a child who rushed past ideas. He sat with them the way he sat with difficult pages in books patiently, turning the thing over until he understood what it actually was. Then he nodded slowly, deliberately, the nod of someone who finds an answer not only acceptable but correct, and who wants you to know that the consideration was real. It was the same instinct, the same quiet refusal to commit to things before they had been earned, that Rowan had carried for as long as he could remember, and had apparently passed on simply by living with this child and letting him watch how a person could choose to move through the world. Rowan picked up his coffee. Outside, the blue of the sky was already thinning toward white at the edges, the day beginning to assert itself the way Dallas mornings do without much announcement, without waiting for anyone to declare themselves ready. Rowan Steele had spent 3 years being invisible in a building full of people who were very well paid to be seen. It took a shake from halfway across the world, a 7-year-old with a well-worn atlas and a CEO who finally stopped walking long enough to look to remind him that the right room had been waiting all along.